Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alabama Women's History Series. My name is Alex Colvin, and I'm the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Before we begin today's program, I have a few quick announcements. First, I'd like to go ahead and invite you back for our next installment of the Women's History Series on Wednesday, March 9th, as a panel of scholars will discuss Alabama suffragists. That will be March 9th at noon Central Time here on our Facebook and YouTube channels. I'd also like to invite you next week as we continue our Food for Thought lecture series when Karen Gray Houston will present Stories from a Daughter of the Boycott. That will be a virtual series, virtual program next Thursday, February 17th at noon here on our Facebook and YouTube channel. Without further ado, I am excited to begin today's panel on Alabama women at work. Our first panelist is Caroline Gebhard, a professor of English, retired in December after 27 years of teaching at Tuskegee University. Today's talk is based on her chapter in the award-winning book, Alabama Women, Their Lives and Times, edited by Susan Youngblood Ashmore and Lisa Lindquist Dorr, which is also available in our online store for purchase. Dr. Gebhard is working on Volume 8, African American Literature and Transition, 1880 to 1900, in a new series from Cambridge University Press, co-edited with Dr. Barbara McCaskill. Welcome, Dr. Gebhard.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here. So I am talking today about Bess Bolden Walcott of Tuskegee. Next slide, please. I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to this topic. I started, and also with Gwendolyn Jones and Vivian Carter, we started the Invisible Legacy, the Women of Tuskegee Project a few years ago now, and we felt that more needed to be done to make the extraordinary accomplishments of Tuskegee women visible. And we were giving a talk on this topic, and Mrs. Carolyn A. Ford approached us and said, do we know about her mother, Bess Bolden Walcott? And once we began to look into Walcott's life, we soon learned just how much she had accomplished and nominated her for admission to the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. She was inducted in 2003. Next slide, please. So who was Bess Bolden Walcott? Well, first of all, she went by BB to friends and colleagues. She truly had an amazing life. She lived to be 101, most of it in Alabama, almost all of it. She was born in Ohio in 1886, and she was recruited at age 22 by Booker T. Washington himself to help him catalog his library. And here's her senior yearbook picture. I'm not sure how much you can see, but one of the comments it makes about her is that that the theory of society that it's androcentric, i.e. male-centered, quote, only draws a lowered eyelid of contempt from her. So you can get a sense of her strong personality. At Tuskegee, in the 50 years that she worked there, she had many, many roles. She was, besides librarian, she was an English teacher, public relations director, administrative assistant to 4 presidents, curator of the George Washington Carver Museum, and helping the Tuskegee to become a National Historic Site. She also directed plays, started publications, mentored students, including Ralph Ellison. And I chose this snapshot of her, although I'm not sure exactly what year it is, because I think it gives you a sense of her lively, vibrant personality and what she calls her insatiable, what she said was her insatiable curiosity. But all of the things I was just telling you that she did, well, that was her day job, in addition to having a husband and 4 children. But now I want to talk, next slide, about what she is most known for. This is her in her Red Cross uniform. She helped, and this was her volunteer work, remember, not her day job initially. She helped found Tuskegee Institute's Red Cross chapter during World War I. And for more than 30 years as the executive secretary of the chapter, and really she was the sort of central force. She helped to alleviate suffering with the chapter in Macon County, disasters like house fires and tornadoes, diseases like tuberculosis, pellagra, that's caused by vitamin B deficiency, and polio, and also hunger during the Great Depression. And so from the 1920s up until 1951, when she finally stepped down, she accomplished a great deal. She's probably most known for her work during World War II, when she became the first acting Red Cross field director who was African American, male or female. And she worked with servicemen and their families, including the Tuskegee Airmen during the war, and also she helped veterans demobilize. And she, after the war, also oversaw the development of a lot of Red Cross programs on first aid, nutrition, nurses' aid training, among many others. And though that wasn't her only work with healthcare, she also was the executive secretary for Tuskegee's chapter of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, that's polio, and she helped to establish the first mental health center in Tuskegee. So next slide, please. So because our time is short, I want to just tell you a story from the first part of her life, how she got started and what the chapter did that was so extraordinary during the Great Flu pandemic of 1918. So the Tuskegee chapter was the brainchild of the Tuskegee Women's Club. And Margaret Murray Washington was its president. That was Washington's third wife. Walcott was the secretary, and there were many other women. And you can see her on the far right in her nurse's uniform, or nurse's aid Red Cross uniform at that point. Now they started organizing the chapter, but they met both internal and external resistance. The president of Tuskegee at the time, Robert R. Moton, was kind of skeptical about the separate chapter for Tuskegee. And also many chapters did not, were controlled by whites and gave African Americans only limited duties. So once they overcame his resistance, they also had to actually enlist the help of a former US president, William Howard Taft, and Harry Hopkins, who was the head of the Southeastern Division of the Red Cross, to just even get permission to form their own chapter. But they were absolutely determined. Next slide, please. Now, the context for this, of course, is the war effort. The Red Cross chapters were encouraged to start by Woodrow Wilson because it was part of the war effort and to support the war effort. And so they had a huge membership drive at the end of September at the Tuskegee Institute Chapel. And the sense in World War I is expressed by one of the speakers of that assembly. Quote, "The Negro is on trial. He must prove to the world not only that he is patriotic, not only efficient, but that he can serve and serve effectively." So there's this pressure to prove that Black Americans have something to contribute, that they are as patriotic, and women too can be part of that effort. Now, I wanted to give you a sense of the kind of compressed timeline here. This major building burned on campus, and all of this happened within a few months, and then the first cases of the Great Flu. If you'll give me the next slide, please. These are the minutes from the executive committee. You can see her signature at the bottom. And Dr. Kenny was requesting help because over 250 students had come down and were hospitalized in the school's hospital. Next slide, please. This was in early October, mid-October. So eventually there would be that's the school's hospital in the background. You can see the horse and buggies. Eventually there would be 449 cases of Spanish influenza in Tuskegee. And I want us to just pause a minute to say that 250 students was 1/6 of the school's student population at the time. And actually 250 students today on campus would be a strain on many institutions. So, and remember that like COVID at first, there was no cure, there was no treatment, there was no vaccine. What the treatment was supportive care and also quarantining, and mask wearing. So if you will advance the next slide, please. Dr. John A. Kenny was a brilliant doctor, and he made sure that there was a quarantine, but he also depended on the Red Cross chapter to relieve the overburdened staff. And also, remember, there's no Walmart, so things like masks and hospital gowns, and in Tuskegee's case, even beds had to be made by Red Cross volunteers and students. If you will advance the next slide, please. So this is a quote from the Tuskegee student after the quarantine was finally lifted. And the school praised the Red Cross volunteers, and remember, Walcott was really the leading figure at that point, because they work like Trojans. They, relieved the staff. They produced all of this equipment, 1,000 napkins for Sputnik, 100 masks, bed protectors, and even beds, as I was saying. So what is also comes through, I think, is this. Well, I also wanted to emphasize that, again, they were also doing their regular day jobs, the Red Cross volunteers, teaching, and on top of all of this work during this time of crisis. So next slide, please. So in closing, I would like to leave you with an image of the Red Cross lady as Phoebe Walcott became known. And I chose this illustration for the book because I think this gives us a sense of the weight of that need to prove oneself. The war is not yet won, it's 44. The Tuskegee Airmen are also still proving themselves, and we see the weight of that, but also the determination to lead a life of service and to provide leadership against overwhelming odds, and to advocate for equal health care for African Americans. So final slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention today. I just want to briefly mention all of the people who've helped me learn about Phoebe Walcott over the years. That's, of course, my partners in the Women of Tuskegee Project, Gwen and Vivian, the Tuskegee University Archive staff, including Dana Chandler, the archivist, Edie Powell, taught me a lot about polio treatment at Tuskegee, Carolyn Ford, of course, the daughter of Mrs. Walcott, and Marion Garman, her granddaughter, and finally, William Penn White, Jr. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gebhard, for that wonderful presentation, also how relevant it is to today. And if you have a question for Dr. Gebhard, go ahead and start putting them in the comments. We're going to have a live Q&A at the end with all of our panelists. So if you have one specifically for her about Bess Bolden Walcott, go ahead and submit that, but also for all of our panelists. Excellent. So our next panelist is going to be Debbie Pendleton. Ms. Pendleton is retired as the Assistant Director for Public Services from the Alabama Department of Archives and History in 2016 after a 31-year career with the department. She received her bachelor's from the University of Montevallo, a postgraduate diploma in librarianship from Leeds Polytechnic, and a master's in history from Auburn University. She's involved with the Alabama Historical Association, serving as its past president, and her research today was actually a part of a larger presentation in last year's annual meeting for the AHA.
Great. Thank you, Alex. I really appreciate being here with you today. What I want to do today is really just introduce the audience to Molly Dowd. Molly Dowd was a champion of Alabama working women, and she's even been called a guardian of Alabama womenfolk. Even though she's little known today, her work grew out of the Progressive era, and her life spanned the first half of the 20th century. She was a leader of the Alabama suffrage movement, and she was active in numerous New Deal progressive causes. Unlike some of her more well-known leaders of the suffrage movement, like Patty Ruffner Jacobs and Bessie O'Brien Hunley, Molly Dowd was a single working woman, and she devoted her life to other working women. She was born Mary Dowd in Tennessee in February 1883. Her family seems to have moved back and forth between Tennessee, Cincinnati, and Huntsville. But then her father died in 1899, and she and her mother moved permanently to Huntsville. This was partially because Molly Dowd's mother's sister was already living there. So in 1900, when the U.S. census taker came by, Molly Dowd was already working, a 17-year-old woman, teacher of dancing. While she was in Huntsville, Molly and her mother became politically active, and they were perhaps members of the Huntsville League for Women's Suffrage. This is a picture from 1895 when the group was formed a few years before the Dowds may have been involved. But I believe that they probably were members because in 1901, Molly Dowd and her mother signed a petition that was sent to the infamous 1901 Alabama Constitutional Convention. And this petition was calling for women's suffrage and was signed by many other members of the Huntsville group. So here we are. In 1901, of course, that convention did not give the rights to vote to women, and in fact restricted voting seriously and disenfranchised many more citizens. But at the dawn of the 20th century, Molly Dowd had started her life of activism as an 18-year-old. Around 1910, Molly moved to Birmingham, and she began working as a sales clerk at Loveman's department store. By 1917, she had been promoted to be an assistant to one of the managers, and she was heading a new social services department that had been established for the department store. Also in Birmingham, Molly joined the Birmingham Equal Suffrage Association and the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. In 1917, she attended a suffrage school where she learned public speaking and organizing and public relations. Apparently, she was quite effective as a public speaker because in 1919, she was chosen to address the state legislature when the group was lobbying for the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And Molly spoke at to the legislature about what the vote could mean for Alabama's working women. Of course, Alabama legislature did not ratify the 19th Amendment, but luckily it was ratified. So Molly Dowd stood in line on the morning of August 27th, 1920, at the Jefferson County Courthouse with a large group of women who went to register to vote for the first time. You see her name listed here in the newspaper, along with some of these more well-known people like Patty Ruffner Jacobs and Alma Rittenberry. By the mid-1920s, Molly Dowd seemed to have left working the department store, and she'd become the secretary first of the Birmingham League of Women Voters and then later of the statewide Alabama League of Women Voters. In this capacity, she handled all the day-to-day business of the organization. She spoke at local meetings around the state, and she was an active lobbyist in Montgomery. One of the major initiatives of the League in the 1920s was the implementation of an 8-hour workday for women who were employed in factories and stores. Despite the fact that Alabama was one of only 5 states with no protections for working women, the League's proposed bills and intense lobbying was met with resistance from mill owners and merchants, and the bills never made it out of committee. Also in the 1920s, Molly Dowd became active in the National Women's Trade Union League. She organized a chapter in Birmingham in 1921, and she was elected to the National Women's Trade Union League board in 1933, one of the very few Southern women on the board. This group was founded in Boston in 1903. It had close ties to the suffrage movement and was supported by many wealthy women who in turn encouraged and supported working women and their union activity. It was due to Molly Dowd's involvement with this organization that she was able to obtain scholarships for 7 Alabama textile workers to attend the national meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1936. League member Eleanor Roosevelt invited these women to stay at the White House, where they were greeted by President Roosevelt, and they had breakfast each morning with Mrs. Roosevelt. This is Molly Dowd, you see here on the front row, second from the left, seated with the other women that attended the meeting. The women shared their rooms at the White House with 8 women from New York State. Nell Morris, the woman in the middle on the front row, remarked to reporters at the time that she stayed in the Lincoln bedroom, but she slept on a Democratic cot. Molly Dowd's work with the Women's Trade Union League led to her being hired as an organizer for the United Textile Workers Union in 1934. And this job was really important to her because the work of the League of Women Voters had mostly dried up during the Depression, and they could not afford to keep her. She worked for the UTW for about a year, helping guide Alabama through a statewide general textile strike in September 1934, which in turn led to a nationwide strike. And this General Textile Strike of 1934 was at the time the largest strike in U.S. labor history. Molly Dowd remained on the UTW staff for about a year until the president of the union decided to let her go because he didn't think organizing was a suitable job for a woman. Thanks to her numerous contacts in New Deal political circles and her reputation as an influential leader among textile workers, she was hired for her next job. In 1936, Governor Bibb Graves approved her being hired as a mediator for the newly formed State Department of Labor. She was the only female mediator, and she traveled throughout the state, working with companies and workers to mediate strikes in textile mills, department stores, laundries, and even roofing companies. The years 1936 to 1938 saw intense union activity among Alabama textile workers due to favorable New Deal labor legislation. In fiscal year 1937, there were 6 strikes involving nearly 4,000 workers. Strikes and local opposition to unions in Huntsville and other towns sometimes led to violence, and there was even a gun battle on the streets of Talladega where several people were killed. Molly Dowd was often brought in to facilitate and moderate between these opposing factions. This often put her at odds with local power structures as she sought to ensure that workers were not evicted from their company homes and that striking workers were not denied relief benefits. So she not only worked to mediate strikes, she was an advocate for workers' families during this time. In 1938, Molly Dowd became involved in another New Deal progressive era cause, the Southern Conference for Human Welfare. The organization was formed to help study the South's particular problems and to advocate for meaningful social change. Molly Dowd helped organize the first meeting in Birmingham in 1938. She spoke at a session on wage earners, and she was elected permanent secretary of the conference at this time. But the conference was engulfed in controversy from the start due to its interracial makeup, support for the abolition of the poll tax, and charges of communist influence. Dowd's role as secretary only lasted for a year, but she did remain active in the organization for several more years. In 1939, Molly Dowd lost her job at the Department of Labor when the new governor, Chauncey Sparks, reorganized it into a less friendly Department of Industrial Relations. So Molly Dowd was now a middle-aged woman with no means of support and in poor health. She lived with her niece's family in Birmingham. She continued to attend occasional meetings of the Women's Trade Union League and write letters to the local paper. But I'm not sure of what her exact health issues were, but throughout the 1930s and 40s, the Women's Trade Union League board referred to her hospitalizations and trips to see specialists. Finally, in December 1953, her condition became critical and she died despite an emergency operation. Her death was widely reported throughout the state. The Birmingham Age Herald summed up her life with these words: "Women folk of Alabama never had a better guardian of their rights than Molly H. Dowd. She never hesitated to take on extra duties if she thought they would serve her country, her state, her city, her fellow working man, and her sex." So while Molly Dowd has been largely forgotten today, her work in the first half of the 20th century was important, and it did help inspire others, and it improved the lives of other Alabama working women. I hope that we can all pause today and thank her and many other women who had the vision and courage to fight for a better Alabama. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and for that amazing presentation, but also for letting us know a little bit more about Molly Dowd, who has also been featured in our exhibit, Justice Not Favor, Alabama Win the Vote. So you can come and see Molly in the context of women's suffrage here at the archives. And we'll have more. If you have a question for Debbie, please put it in the comments, and we'll get to them after our final presentation. Our final presentation is from Peggy Allen Towns, who is a native of Decatur, Alabama. Her expertise is preserving the voices and legacy of African Americans in her hometown. She is a historian, lectures and facilitates workshops on genealogy. She is a historian who lectures and facilitates workshops on genealogy and locals. Peggy has authored 3 books, Duty Driven, The Plight of North Alabama's African Americans During the Civil War, Scottsboro Unmasked, Decatur's Story, which is available in our online bookstore, and Scapegoat, The Tommy Lee Hines Story. Welcome to Peggy Allen Towns.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce Mrs. Eva A. Sturz. While I didn't know Mrs. Sturz personally, the more I discovered about her, the more fascinated I was at her wits and strength. I present Mrs. Sturz. I am Mrs. Eva Adelaide Young Sturz. I was born in 1869 in Cincinnati, Ohio, 4 years after emancipation. My parents, Andrew and Eva Young, had always been free people of color. They sadly died when I was young. My siblings and I lived with my grandmother after that, Mrs. Delaney, in Detroit, Michigan. I attended Detroit public schools and furthered my education at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. At the time, W.E.B. Du Bois was a student there also. I suppose you're wondering what my Alabama connection is. Well, in 1886, I was introduced to my beloved Willis E. Sturz. Willis was a medical student at the University of Michigan. After graduating in 1888, Dr. Sturz and I married and moved to his hometown in Montgomery, Alabama. He practiced medicine there for a short while. We heard about a unique opportunity in North Alabama. So in June 1890, we relocated to Decatur, Alabama. Dr. Sturz was the first doctor of color in town. He established a very successful practice, and I got a job teaching in the county. Not long after, we opened Magnolia Drugstore. Slide 4, please. I say we because you've heard it. Behind every successful man is a good, supportive woman, right? Well, it's true. I took my place behind the counter until the business grew in such proportion that it was necessary to hire a pharmacist. Later, we opened People's Dry Good and Furniture Store. With me not keeping a keen eye on the books, the business suffered financially. I later went to Chicago to attend millinery school, came back home, and turned that business around. For 6 years, I maintained the books before going home to be a housewife. We attended the historic First Baptist Colored Church on Vine Street, where yours truly served as organist. We were delighted to retain Wallace Rayfield, the famous Black architect, to design the present church. Next slide. I served on the Ladies Auxiliary Board and the Negro Citizens Committee, a group established to bring culture to the city. We entertained famous people like concert singers Martha Anderson, Anita Patty Brown, and the Williams Singers here at my church. In 1901, Alabama was about to adopt a new constitution. My husband pled with the state legislatures to pen a fair constitution, one that would not disenfranchise people. His letter was read on the House floor during the Constitutional Convention, but to no avail. We in Alabama are still governed by that Constitution. Also, in 1901, my friend and neighbor, Mrs. Minnie Cashin, was elected vice president of the Alabama Federation Colored Women's Club. I also was a member. We ladies joined forces to address the needs of health of women and children in our community. But one of our most treasured undertakings was for me and my husband to open the Cottage Home Infirmary, the first hospital ever in the city of Decatur. We opened in 1900. The name derived from the 3-room cottage that was originally used as a recovery room for patients who had had surgery. Within a year of its opening, 2 more rooms were added. We provided services free of charge to people who could not pay. In January 1910, the infirmary moved out of the small cottage and into our newly constructed 2-story, 18-room cottage home infirmary and nurses training school. During the 3-year program for nurses, we provided free nursing classes, room, board, books, and uniforms to select young women. I taught classes there. Also, in 1910, the Guardian newspaper rolled off the press. Next slide, please. Published by yours truly. Printed from 1910 to 1917, the Black newspaper cost 50 cents a year. Started out with 4 pages, and we increased it to 8. It chronicled daily Black life in our communities, social and cultural happenings, church and school news, people visiting and traveling, business news, of course, people who were admitted and discharged from the hospitals, and even world reports. I often printed articles from the National Women's Temperance Union that included prison reform and suffrage. I can boast too. My paper was never late, and unto this day, I am the only female who has ever owned and operated a newspaper in Decatur, Alabama. In 1920, enough states finally ratified the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. What a victory. For the first time in Alabama's history, women voted. I was among the first women in Morgan County to register, pay my poll tax, and vote. Note my name on line 34. The next year, tragedy struck. My beloved Willis drowned while fishing. That broke my heart so. He was so well thought of that people came from all around to pay their respects. Many even followed the train to Montgomery, where he was funeralized at his home church at Dexter Avenue Baptist. After Dr. Sturr's death, the hospital struggled. Both the Negro and white communities tried to keep it afloat, but eventually it closed. Now, shortly after my husband's death, I rented the old clinic to a young man for an undertaker shop. Friends would tell me, "You ought to tell him to move." I'll let them know quickly, "Mr. Reynolds' customers don't bother me none because they don't make any noise." I have a heart for the advancement of my people. And at my passing in February 1958, I left very generous endowments to several organizations, including Lakeside High School, my beloved church, and the Boys Club that would later be named in my honor. A library, street, and today a daycare and cemetery is named for us. I am interred next to my beloved Dr. Willis E. Sturrs at the Oakwood Cemetery in Montgomery, Alabama. A reminder to all of us, history, ancient and modern, here and there, brings to light deeds of heroism that make our dumb with amazement. The Guardian newspaper, 1916. Signing off, Mrs. Eva A. Sturrs. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Peggy. And thank you to all of our amazing panelists who are now joining us again for our live Q&A. So if you have a question for any of our individual panelists or the panel in general, please feel free to put it in the comments. We will be able to get to your questions. But I first have a few questions of my own to get us started. First off, thank you. Each of you gave an amazing presentation, and you also did something very difficult, which is take someone's life and whittle it down to a 10 to 12 minute presentation, which is always impossible. So I know there are things that you didn't get to say in your presentation. So during this Q&A, hopefully you'll be able to tease out some more details for us about each of these amazing women. The first one I have is kind of tied to what I mentioned after Debbie's presentation. We have this exhibit now open. It's a Justice Not Favor Alabama Women in the Vote. And the focus on it is, of course, women's suffrage. But we also have all these other components in it about women getting involved in other progressive era reform, activism, and occupations. And so I'm curious to see if Bess Bolden Walcott, we heard from the other two that they were involved in the suffrage movement. Was Bess Bolden Walcott involved in it? Maybe what other activism or reform movements these women were involved in, but also how their role as a professional woman was tied to their activism. Was there any kind of relationship between the two? And we can start with, we want to start with you, Dr. Gebhard.
Well, she was a supporter of women's rights, and later in her life, she joined the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. But I would say, and the Tuskegee Women's Club also was interested in topics about suffrage, but it was complicated because there was the feeling that until Black men got the vote, that needed, in some people thought that needed to take priority. So there was the Women's Club actually had a debate about that early on. So it's complicated, but she definitely was a supporter of women's rights.
And do we have any kind of connection between their role as a professional woman, meaning like someone who is not, who's going outside of the home, working outside of the home? Is there any connection between that and their activist work? There's some, I know, direct connections with Molly Dowd, seeing as how she was so involved in labor unions, and she was someone who was kind of, active as a businesswoman in Birmingham. But is there any kind of other, do we see any kind of connections between their identity as a professional woman and their role in reform?
I'll speak for a few more minutes about Molly Dowd. I think that one thing that was so particularly important for her, because she was a single professional woman herself, she had to work. And she understood that there were other women who had to work and that they needed rights, and they had responsibilities, but they needed rights as working women. So I think she advocated for working women largely because she knew what it was to work herself. She didn't have a husband to support her. She didn't have, she was lucky that she had an extended family that was very supportive, and she lived with them most of her life. And I'm not really sure she would have been able to do what she did if she'd not had that family to support her, since she didn't have a husband.
And as you know, with the Black suffrage, it was a little different from that of the white women, quite a bit different. The women not only were major influences in the community, but they were concerned about education, and not just education in the classroom, but your health. They were also concerned with wages and that kind of reform. So that was primarily what they, as well as suffrage. So that was primarily what they were concerned about, looking at the community, the Black community as a whole.
Yeah, if I could just add that that's exactly right, because during this era, professional Black women, that is those like Bess Bolden Walcott, I mean, she was one of 3 African-American women to actually graduate from Oberlin. They felt a tremendous sense of responsibility toward the community and to be engaged in all sorts of things. So I don't think there was such a division in a way as between home life and the community life. Would you agree with that?
That's true. They, in Decatur, they also brought in the arts, cultural activities, anything that would progress the community, they were involved in it.
Yes, and Walcott was very involved in cultural events and arts, and of course literature. She taught literature, so plays and so yes, that the sort of developing the whole person and the whole community. Yes,
kind of creating, as historians have called it, the new woman of that progressive era, the woman who is all of these things kind of coming together. And that, like you said, that division between home life and public life is starting to blur. And they're seeing it all as their responsibility. But three very different approaches to how you handle that and what it even means for them. And it kind of shows you that what I love about hearing all of your presentations of these women is they have so many things in common, but they're also different as well. And it kind of shows how variety, like how the various kind of experiences women had at the time. We kind of tend to lump everybody in together. Everyone was a suffragist or they were all this, but each of them had their own kind of journey and path that really helps complicate that story a little bit more for us. We have our first question from an audience member. Scotty E. Kirkland asks, Peggy, you are right that Willis Sturr's letter to the 1901 convention delegates was one of the most powerful they received. Do you have any sense of what Eva Sturz was doing in 1901? Was she a part of any women's groups in Montgomery at the turn of the century?
Now, in 1901, keep in mind that her friend, Minnie, Mrs. H.V. Cash and Minnie Cashion, had just gotten elected as vice president of the Alabama Federation of Colored Women. So I believe that she was perhaps pulled into that as well.
Perfect.
That just reminds me of another thing that I really, since we had such a small amount of time to talk about our people, Molly Dowd was also, the club women movement was very important to Molly Dowd, like it was for all of these other women at that time period. She was involved in numerous clubs, and they gave her, like they did all these other women, a sense of what they could do to affect change within their society.
Yes, Bess Bolden Walcott was very active in the Tuskegee Women's Club, which was part of that federation. So I'm sure she would have known. Margaret Murray Washington was a president of the National Club, and they did a lot of work on things like reform schools for boys so that they wouldn't have to go into male adult prisons, and just a whole range of activities.
And the Sturrs, of course, with them being in the health care profession, they also provided classes, health classes. Dr. Sturrs and Mrs. Sturrs went to various churches, schools, and all over to talk about health.
And so it was about kind of expanding beyond into the community. And so that's really what this club work was about. And that kind of goes along with, their profession. So the profession might be, they're working in this one occupation for, either money or something, but then they're expanding it out in this club work into being more volunteer work, is what I'm hearing, is that they also are volunteering their extra time to help out in the community. And that's just a kind of a part of that, again, that progressive era woman who is, trying to become more involved and help with reform. So I've heard prison reform was big for Bess Bolden Walcott and the Tuskegee Women's Clubs. What other kind of reform, as far as education or other things, where was Bess Bolden Walcott involved in with Tuskegee women? We have Red Cross, and later on, you said she was involved with another kind of women's movement.
The International League of Peace and Freedom. That was later in like this.
Yeah.
Well, think they did do things like raise money for scholarships. They were also involved in raising some money for as Black women's clubs across the country to make sure that Frederick Douglass's historic home in Washington, D.C. was preserved. So, I mean, it's hard to think of an area they weren't involved in. And one thing that may surprise people is that there was also a sense, especially for instance during World War I and II too, that the women's clubs were called upon to support the Black men in uniform, and so they had Negro women's circles for war relief, and the Red Cross is also part of that. So that I think people don't realize the impact of segregation and how hard that made it hard for people in every walk of life, and how much the women felt the need to fill those gaps.
Yes. So, and you brought up another point of coming in with World War One and kind of your presentation is really focused a lot on her work with the Red Cross in that time. Ms. Pendleton and Ms. Towns, do you have any kind of way where do you know about how your women were involved in that the war? Were they involved in the war effort? Kind of things that they kind of helped out, or how they contributed to the war effort?
I'm not sure about Mrs. Sturz. Of course, Dr. Sturz died in 1921, and several prominent people in the community were involved with Red Cross, and I was fascinated to read not long ago about how they were holding meetings at First Baptist Church for the soldiers and their families. And I think somebody mentioned earlier Frederick Douglass, the Club Indicator put on shortly after Frederick Douglass' passing programs just to make, and they proceeded every year just to make people aware of this great orator.
Molly Dowd was also involved in a lot of World War I Liberty Bond drives, war efforts. One of the things that she helped spearhead in Birmingham was attempts to train women workers to fill some of the jobs that men had left behind. So they were training women in Birmingham to become stenographers and to do other things that they needed for the war effort. So she was heavily involved in supporting the war effort in those ways.
Which is something I remember was when Dr. Gaylor was talking about it, I realized that these moments were the ones that all of your women shared, because they all died at different times. So the one lifespan goes all the way to the 1980s, the other is 1950s, and one unfortunately ends early in the 1930s. But I was just thinking through what are some of the big moments of their life, and World War I was obviously one of those huge moments that they all shared, as well as other activist movements like suffrage and reform and that progressive era. Like that's kind of some of the things that define them. So I was just curious to figure out what some of the other women were doing and helping out in that era. Before we end, I have just one final question, and I guess it's a way for you to plug anything else you want for these women. The last thing, what is the lasting legacy of each of these women? What if they could define themselves of what they wanted their legacy to be, or what you want people to know about them in the simplest way you can, what would their legacy be for Alabama, for the movements that they were a part in, for their profession?
With Mrs. Sturz being such a philanthropist, I think she would share with the Alabama Federation Colored Women's motto, "Lift as we climb," because that's what she was definitely all about.
I think for Bess Bolden Walcott, what really I am drawn to is the humanitarian, the willingness to give of self for others, and and doing that all the way through her long life. And that's just it's just extraordinary, I think. But she's also very interesting as a writer. I mean, she was a really good writer, and so she lived a very full life as well. So.
And I think similarly, Molly Dowd, one of the things that really struck me is that her whole life was devoted to trying to help other people and to be involved in her community, to make life better for everybody around her. She also influenced a lot of women that came behind her, that became active in social activists. And just that unique thing of being a woman who did all that without a college education, a working woman herself, and somebody who devoted her life to making sure that simple working women were seen for their full potential.
That's something I love about the series, is that we focus in on individual women. And sometimes when you look at larger picture, you focus on a lot of these organizations, these clubs, associations, but it was also individuals who made a difference. Individuals make up each of those clubs. And so thank you all for sharing with us 3 remarkable women who made a difference in Alabama. And thank you to all of you who joined us here today. And you can continue to leave comments and we can share them with our speakers if you have questions as you come across it. And I hope to see you all again next month as we look at Alabama suffragists. Thank you.
Thank you.